I'd agree with what Dr. Chipman has just said about the quality of this dialogue, and I believe, John, having attended the last one here, that it's deeper, richer, and more productive. So congratulations to you and your team. We've been asked to set the challenges of this region, the Middle East, within a wider global context in terms of the foreign policy and security policy priorities faced elsewhere in the international community. The beginning of wisdom in my analysis is always this: to understand the interests and values of others and the priority which they attach to them, to be equally clear-minded about the interests and values which you have and the priority which you attach to them, and then third, to work on how we define a rules-based order which maximises cooperation, minimises conflict, and manages competition on the way through. So where does this region, the Middle East, fit within the broader set of global priorities, given we have been debating this last day and a half or 2 days now the intrinsics of Syria, the intrinsics of Iran, the intrinsics of the Middle East peace process, and more broadly what is happening with what was called, and by some still is called, the Arab Spring as it works its way across the region, and the current dynamics unfolding in Egypt. Much has been made of the United States and what many have described as a deficit of US leadership in this region. Let me be very blunt, as we Australians tend to be, about what I think is right and wrong about that observation. Put yourself in Washington at the moment and consider where the US political process now sits against its competing priorities. Three great challenges face the US body politic right now, none of which directly have to do with this region. Number one, the fact that for the last 5 years the United States has been going through a global economic challenge / crisis / low growth, no growth, and declining employment and barely recovering employment, the worst since the United States has experienced since the Depression, and, frankly, a massive interruption to what has been the norm of post-war economic growth and employment growth in the United States for the last 2/3 of a century. So number 1, 2, and 3 priority in Washington, whoever you speak to, is simply how do you get this economy back going again? And this has a huge impact. It also is having a huge impact, I believe, in American national and international self-confidence in terms of their ability to reconstitute the fundamentals of growth, whether it's to do with macroeconomic policy or the nature of US global economic engagement. Challenge number 2 is that all this is occurring at a time when the US foreign and security policy establishment and its corporate establishment is looking at the historic rise of China. This is, in China's books, the re-emergence of China after 200 years slumbering. For the rest of the world, it's seen as the rise of China. Let's put it into its historical context. In the next decade, China will emerge as the world's largest economy. When that occurs, it'll be the first time since George III was on the throne of England that you will have a non-Western, non-English speaking, non-democratic state as the world's largest economy. This is not a small development in human history. It is a very large development. And the United States, together with its friends and partners in Asia, are fully seized of the dimensions of this reality. The third big challenge from Washington's perspective, if you're looking at how to manage A and B above, is the historic dysfunctionalism of the system of the United States government itself in terms of the management of the relationship between the White House and the Congress. We're currently, the topic du jour is the Fiscal Cliff. It is simply one in a long series of impasses between the administration and the Congress going back quite a period of time now. And this looms as a massive challenge, not just for the US domestic body politic, but for the rest of the world as well. Its ability to restart the economy and to engage with confidence again in the task of global and regional leadership very much are shaped by the nature of the polity itself. In this context, so where does the Middle East fit? It looms as a significant, but by no means the major set of priorities that confront the US administration right now. So much for the United States. What about our hemisphere, Asia? Given that it is in the headlines a lot, but no one really asks the question, how important is the Middle East in the eyes of the Asian hemisphere? Let me put it to you in these terms. Asia over the last 10 years has moved from the margins to the centrality of the global economic agenda. Everyone, I think, now accepts that. It is no longer a prospect, it is a reality. But here's the second one, the characteristic which I think dominates so much of the thinking in our part of the world. Asia itself is rich with the modernizing forces of globalizing economies now constituting the powerhouse of global economic growth on the one hand, and the other forces at work in Asia cutting across those forces of economic modernization and growth and transformation are what I describe as the residual and strong, and in some cases rising forces of a 19th century set of nationalisms. And these forces are working like that across the region. And you don't have to look very far, whether it's between the two Koreas, the Taiwan Straits, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and of course the continuing challenges in the relationship between Beijing and New Delhi. These are large forces at work. Of course, the epicenter of this is China itself. For 30 years, we've seen the success of Chinese economic transformation. 30 years ago, the Chinese economy, as an historical reference point, was the same size in global terms as the economy of the Commonwealth of Australia. 30 years later, it is about to overtake the United States. This has been a pretty successful economic transformation in economic historical terms. However, the Chinese are equally challenged by their own domestic challenges of transforming the new growth model, adjusting the new leadership to the challenges of that model, environmental sustainability, social expectations, but also a crisis of confidence about the Communist Party itself, and therefore the continuing importance of Chinese nationalism. So looked at from Asia's perspective, where does the Middle East loom? I would say it would be seen in our part of the world, our future would be seen as understandably Asia-centric. The central objective is how to preserve Asian peace, which we've had now for the last 35 years since the fall of Saigon. How to avoid, in particular, conflict between the United States and China and regional states over the South China Sea, and how to underpin the continued strategic stability we've had to continue to prosecute the economic growth agenda of the region as a whole and to lift the remaining hundreds of millions out of poverty. And the Middle East sits in that. Frankly, I think it would be seen as being a significant interest of our region, but by no means major and by no means dominant. In terms of the region's economic, energy security, of course it is of continuing significance, but if I was to list to you the region's top 10 priorities, the Middle East does not rank among them, if I'm being perfectly candid to a forum such as this. Let's look at the other slice of the world's reality, which is Europe itself. When we in Australia look at Europe, we see a Europe which is increasingly introspective, with some exceptions. We see a Europe which is increasingly dedicated to putting its own economic house in order, somewhat analogous to the challenges of the United States. And to the extent that the Europe has constituted a wider foreign policy energy beyond its borders, it has been to manage its own EU expansion program with the associated tensions which arise from that with Russia. And beyond that, of course, some continuing interest on the part of the Europeans in terms of North Africa and the Middle East. But if you were to put the priorities together in Brussels, this does not loom as their number one or number two priority, if I'm being perfectly blunt about it as I perceive it. There are certain national governmental exceptions to that, and the Government of the United Kingdom, whose views were well reflected here yesterday by Foreign Secretary William Hague, a good friend and former good colleague. But if I was to try and explain the centre of gravity as to how I see Europe as a whole, that's where it stands. Putting all that together, therefore, where Asia stands, where Europe stands, the relative priorities attaching to this region from the United States itself, given its three great challenges, there's another set of concerns which confront the international community as well. The functioning of the order itself, climate change, trade liberalisation, irregular people movements, terrorism, non-proliferation, for which frankly, North Korea looms as a more immediate and well-developed challenge than even to our friends in Iran. And then, of course, the rest of the world is focused on the next chapter in the global economic story emerging out of sub-Saharan Africa and broader Africa, as well as the great unfoldings of the 600 million plus people who live in Latin America. Therefore, globally, I say this with great respect to our friends in the Middle East, that with the exception of a number of good folks from our hemisphere in Asia, like myself, who make a continued and professional study of this region, it does not loom large in our set of collective top 10 priorities. If it is in the top 10, it's in the latter 5 of the top 10. In my remaining 5 minutes, let me just speak briefly, therefore, about the intrinsic challenges within the region and how this global set of prioritizations, therefore, impact. I think what the world increasingly thinks when it looks at the challenges of this region was touched on by many yesterday about the expectation that the region attends internally to an increasing number of its own challenges, by which I mean look at the great success story, or the relative success story, described by 2 highly eloquent ministers yesterday in terms of the GCC's initiatives in dealing with the challenges of Yemen. Look also at what the role of the Arab League in responding to the challenges of Libya in the lead up to military intervention there. Look at the unfolding diplomacies which we've just discussed in the in-camera session on Syria from many of the countries of this region as well. And historically, of course, the role of the Arab peace plan vis-a-vis Palestine. The critical question is, going back to the challenge posed by many and sharply in this region yesterday, is so where does the United States now fit in? And bearing in mind its other challenges as well. I think it's important to look, frankly, at some objective factors here. Let me go directly to the question of the pivot, given that we are supposed to be one of those who have been pivoted to rather than pivoted from, that is, us in Asia. The pivot, I think, is generally accepted in the international literature is an unfortunate term, but let's deal beneath the language of foreign policy and strategic discourse to the reality. What the United States was doing to its friends in Asia and the Pacific, and let's call it the Indo-Pacific region more broadly, is sending out a very clear signal that the United States in this dynamic region called the Indo-Pacific region or the Asia-Pacific region is there strategically to stay. And it's reflected it in 3 pillars of policy. One, its diplomatic re-engagement in the region. It's now a member of the East Asian Summit, the first time that it's been around the table of a multilateral security organization in Asia for God knows how long. Secondly, by announcing that there will be no net withdrawal of US strategic assets from Asia, was sending a very clear message to all its friends and partners and its competitors in the region that it was there to stay. And thirdly, also a trade diplomacy through the Trans-Pacific Partnership to wrap the region up in a series of interlocking free trade agreements. When I look at this region, I ask myself a basic analytical question. Is there anything on the drawing boards or in reality or in prospect about a net drawdown, for example, of the units of the Fifth Fleet, moored just beyond our building here in Bahrain? Answer, no. Is there any net attenuation of assets which would fall within CENTCOM's command for this wider region? The answer is no, of course with the notable exception of the drawdown which inevitably will occur in Afghanistan. So on a core strategic analysis, let us not assume that this pivot, this rebalance to the Asia-Pacific actually represents a net downsizing of presence in this command region. It actually does not, in my analysis. Nor does it represent a diminution of American diplomacy in the region either, based on my analysis of it. If there is one strategic, shall I say, price payer for the pivot, the rebalance, or whatever you want to call it, to Asia, it's Europe. And there's a view which has been emerging in Washington for a long, long time, that if Europe's going to continue to generate national defence outlays of 0.9% of GDI on average, that the time comes for Europe to begin to pay more for its own security and the US in relative terms to pay less. Therefore, I would say this to our friends in the Middle East, before everyone gets mesmerised by the language of the pivot and mesmerised by the language of the rebalance, go to its core strategic content. I think it actually speaks to a different reality. And finally, to address 1 or 2 or 3 specific regional challenges where US leadership remains critical. Number 1, and this is where US leadership makes a material difference. Israel-Palestine. The US presidential election has been won. There is now looming, of course, Israeli elections. The vote has occurred in the UN General Assembly on the question of the observer status of the Palestinian Authority. Once we are through these Israeli elections, as many of my colleagues said yesterday, it is paramount that US leadership come to the fore in bringing this peace process to a conclusion, consistent with the principles of the Arab Peace Plan of 2002. If not, I fear, simply looking at it from a perspective of Israeli national security, where their circumstances will end up. And I do not see a benign set of circumstances unfolding in terms of the re-legitimization, the re-radicalization of Hamas, the prospects of a further intifada within Israel itself, with the disillusioned Palestinian youth, the fractures which occur across the Arab world, which will see their way through to the future of the Egyptian peace treaty and possibly that with Jordan as well. This is the time to act. And I don't think President Netanyahu did his own cause a whole lot of good when he handled the US president in the way in which he handled him on his last visit to Washington, or the one before, when he was present in the Oval Office. I don't think that message has been lost on the Obama administration. On Syria, people often complain about the lack of US leadership. I know Susan Rice very well, I know Hillary Clinton very well. The amount of diplomatic effort which has gone into the UN Security Council processes over Syria have been formidable. The resistances there lie elsewhere, as everyone in this room is familiar. Russia has a stated position and China has a stated position. Can I simply make this point as someone who's spent his career studying China, Chinese language, Chinese history, China's foreign policy? Our good friends in China will not welcome my saying this, but let me say this. I've already seen the emergence of a gap between Chinese and Russian official positions on Syria. It's very important that those in the region, the GCC, the Arab League and elsewhere, have a very clear position to put to Beijing in terms of what they want out of the UNSC now on the question of Syria. And in terms of broader UN preparations for Syria, I say publicly what I just concluded privately in our discussion on Syria just now. There must be prepared now a comprehensive UN Security Council resolution for post-Assad Syria containing all the elements from peace enforcement, peace stabilization, peacekeeping, humanitarian intervention, economic reconstruction, WMD consolidation and the rest, and an operational plan to make it work as of day one. Failing that, a strategic vacuum would emerge in post-Assad Syria, which would make, as I said before, post-Gaddafi Libya look like a Sunday school picnic. Finally, on Iran. The resolutions, both of the IAEA and the UN Security Council, are robust and strong. The key question in terms of the sanctions regime is to make it work. And again, I would draw attention to the attitude of all states to that, including our good friends in China, in making it work, and that requires our GCC colleagues to do the same. So, from the world's perspective, from the United States' perspective, this region remains of continuing significance, but it occurs within a world of multiple conflicting and overriding priorities. But within the claims about US leadership in the region and the significance of the pivot, I would go back to what I said before, look beyond the language to its strategic substance, and to the specific challenges on our agenda on the Middle East peace process, on Syria, and the question of Iran. I believe we need to be very specific about our calls for demonstrations of US leadership, but where I believe it must come and must come first is on the question of Palestine. Thank you very much.